Thank you everyone for joining us today in the WABSI, West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute series of big issues in biodiversity science webinars. The last for 2022. It seems amazing to be at that point of the year already, where we're at our last webinar for the year. In opening our webinar today, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land which I'm joining you from here in Perth, the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Very important for those of us working in the environmental sciences and in biodiversity science to consider, particularly here in Australia, where we live on land that has been occupied, managed and cared for many tens of thousands of years. The knowledge and an ongoing connection to country of the traditional owners where we are, and wherever you are joining us from, extend those respects to the elders of the traditional owners of the lands. It's particularly relevant to today's topic, but something that we ensure we bear in mind in all of our discussions and place at the beginning of our conversation and embed throughout our thinking. Today we're exploring with three presenters from New Zealand, joining us from New Zealand to reflect on some of their experience and hopefully draw some comment from our audience today around principles and guiding indicators for co-producing knowledge through the development of enduring and trustful partnerships, something that's essential in ensuring equitable communication and equitable knowledge sharing with our partners. So I thank Alison, Nick and Andrea for joining us today. Before handing over to them, I should have introduced myself. I'm Owen Nevin. I'm the CEO of the Western Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. WABSI is a joint venture of 10 organisations, 4 universities, CSIRO, the Commonwealth Science Industry Research Organisation, and 4 government departments here in Western Australia who have responsibility for environment, regulation, management, and biodiversity. We are an organisation who facilitate collaboration between researchers and end users of that research knowledge. We are guided by the needs of those end users in developing research endeavours, which create opportunity for meaningful change. So endeavouring to really create impactful research by addressing the needs of the end users, land managers, regulators, industry, government and community in the state here in Western Australia. We facilitate those endeavours around what are often termed wicked problems, where there are multiple stakeholders, multiple end users, and there's an overlap of research management, policy communication, and all of those challenging things for those many stakeholders. And as we work through that process, we go through an iterative discussion between those end users, the researchers that are closing the knowledge gaps, and looping back to ensure that that knowledge flows to those end users. You may have come across some of our outputs across a range of topics, from ferals and invasives to the recently released Biodiversity Knowledge Priorities document, which was launched at the end of October as a guiding document for our work in the next 5 to 10 years. Our presenters today, as I mentioned, are joining us from across in New Zealand. Alison, Andrea and Nick, welcome and thank you. I hope we have a very conversational approach today with more of a panel than a single presentation, and to enable that to run, I'm going to hand the reins over to Alison to lead off. I'll stop presenting and over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Owen and Preeti, and thank you. We really appreciate the invitation to come and talk with you today, because we are really keen to hear how what we've been learning in Aotearoa, New Zealand connects or doesn't connect with what you're all learning in Western Australia. But just before I begin, I will also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all are gathering today. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here online with us today, and any of our Māori or colleagues or others that have a connection to Aotearoa as well. And I'm Alison Greenaway, and I am a social researcher with Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, but I'm also involved with our Biological Heritage Challenge in Aotearoa. And so a lot of what I'm sharing with you today is connected to work that has been undertaken through that National Science Challenge. The key message that we want to share with you is that we are finding it useful for biodiversity to put our methods under the microscope with our colleagues before we put anything else under it, before we put leaves, plants, bees, fungi, perceptions, budgets under our lens of inquiry. It's useful just to stop and put our own methods under that lens first of all. So I'm going to share my screen now as I launch into the presentation, and hopefully this works all right. All good, Owen?
Perfect.
Lovely. So we're talking about guiding indicators for co-producing knowledge through enduring and trustful relationships. We're just going to share a few of them with you today, and there are more that you can find out if you want to delve into some of the publications that I'll mention. So this presentation is very much an opportunity for us to practice how, when and where we show up as non-Indigenous researchers in conversations about colonisation and the often traumatic legacies of science. One intention for our research is to move beyond the white saviour identity that has been core to much social science. So we're doing this by putting our social research cultures under the microscope or through our lens of inquiry, instead of focusing on Indigenous peoples, their beliefs and practices as the subjects of social research, which has tended to happen too much in the past. But first, we'll introduce ourselves a bit further before we go into that, and you'll hear a little bit about who we are and how we got here. So I'm going to ask Andrea to introduce herself first.
Hello everyone, thank you all for joining. So I'm Andrea Grant, and I'd like to weave the story of the treaty into my sort of personal context for this work. I'm Australian, and I from waves of migration from the legacy of colonisation. I grew up in Australia, and I'm very aware of how Australia was seen as an empty land as a result of colonisation, and that there are different treaty contexts. With Aotearoa signing a treaty with the British Empire and Australia not having done that. So the differences in how Indigenous people have become part of the governing context is an interesting thing for me as an Australian that has now working in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And some of the things I've been learning are the strengths of resistance to being colonised in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is not without its problems. Having the legacy of colonisation through the various legislations that have been imposed from arrivals. So seeing Indigenous people as someone with wisdom and knowledge to survive as a culture, and a people with connections to the natural environment that sustain them for 60, 70,000 years is an important reference for me as an Australian growing up in Australia. And I think that we've got much to learn from such a culture of being in relationship with nature for such a long time. So starting my research career in Australia, working with a Western knowledge system, but acknowledging the importance of local knowledge and its limited influence alongside scientific research. This is an initiation that spawned an interest in collaborative approaches for me as into natural resource management. So in 2016, I was invited to be part of a Crown Research Institute for Forestry in Aotearoa, and to work in a context of interdisciplinary research with Māori. So this is a new experience for me, to be working directly with Indigenous peoples, which I didn't have the opportunity to do in Australia. I've learned so much about the importance of history and relationships between people and environments, and the ongoing trauma of being colonised did not end with the signing of the treaty or Te Tiriti, but became the start of a process of oppression, marginalisation and disempowerment of Māori people and their place, culture, practice and knowledge. So this has been an important catalyst for me to be thinking differently about how we work in the science practice that we're involved in. I'll hand over to Nick to introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Nick Kirk. I'm an environmental social researcher who works with Alison at Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. And my background is in natural resource management, primarily in freshwater and in farming, but I have worked across quite a few different areas in my time. And most of these have also been subjects which are very, very relevant to Māori here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So really my start in this space was when I was a student, and I was employed as a research assistant by my supervisor, who was a non-Indigenous person of colour. And he was invited into many different Indigenous spaces, in particular with research that he led on Māori commercial fisheries management in New Zealand. And this was really eye-opening experience for me as a very young researcher, and gave me plenty of opportunities to begin learning about this space. But when I reflect on this work and sort of think about the topic of today, it's not the kind of work that we could recreate now. Myself and my supervisor, as two non-Indigenous researchers, were really doing research on these communities rather than with and for them and partnering with them. Although because of his experience and his reputation, he was invited into these spaces. Like I say, this isn't the kind of research that we would be able to recreate, or that I would feel comfortable recreating again. So although I really appreciated those opportunities and what I learned from them, it's not the sort of research that I would engage in anymore. And I think over the course of my young career, I have seen that the standards of engagement in regards to working with Indigenous communities has changed a lot. And that's something that I look forward to both sharing with you and hearing from you later on when we sort of pose some questions back to the audience. So yeah, that's a quick introduction from me. Now maybe back to Alison.
Thanks, Nick. So, as I said, I'm a geographer, a senior researcher with Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. And a couple of years ago, I published a paper with Nick, Andrea, and some other colleagues, which was an opportunity for us to write together and reflect on how our relationships of working with Māori were developing, what we were learning. And the reason I wanted to do that is that there were actually very few spaces for that kind of reflection to happen. And as a social researcher, I know that that kind of networked learning and reflection is so important for building capabilities. So that was an intention behind writing the paper, and you'll get the title of it when I put the slide up. And that's the paper that Owen or Preeti or someone in the Western Australia Biodiversity Science Institute found, and then it's the basis on which we're here. Now, the work that sits behind that paper comes because I and a colleague were invited to work with Ngāi Tūhoi in Te Urewera. And so some of you might have heard about Te Urewera because it is one of the first forests to get legal personification. And so as part of the settlement process that Ngāi Tūhoi had with our Crown, and the return of their management and governance of Te Urewera was that Te Urewera would get legal personification. So they were quite keen, Ngāi Tūhoi, to find out how relationships with Te Urewera as this legal persona were developing. And so a colleague and I were invited in to explore how friendships with Te Urewera had developed since settlement. So the phrasing that is used by Ngāi Tūhoi was that we are manuhiri. As friends with Te Urewera, we are manuhiri, those guests who have responsibility and connections to Te Urewera. So we were exploring that, and through that process, it really, I felt very much invited into a conversation to deepen my understanding about being manuhiri and having a friendship with a place and its people. But also working in Manaaki Whenua, it became quite apparent and challenging that we perhaps weren't being the best friends we could be as a science organisation. And so that questioning around how we were operating as a science organisation in relationship with an Indigenous people who were reconnecting with their area is an ongoing question that I'm involved with, and was what I was trying to explore through the methodological sensitivities paper. And one of the key insights, just to reiterate, that was very much that being invited into a place, but also being offered a relational framing from an Indigenous community were two key things that have really shaped how I'm exploring my methodologies now. So there you go. This is on the screen is the document that I was involved with writing about friendships for and with Te Urewera, and just some of the key reflections that came out of that work and out of writing the paper that's down below, Methodological Sensitivities for Co-producing Knowledge, that the importance of arriving in research sites with care.
I'll just interrupt you a second there. I don't think you're sharing the screen that you're.
I'm not sure. Thank you very much for that reminder. Thank you. Now, let's get out of that. Click the right buttons. There we go. Do that first of all. Right. Thanks, Owen. How's that?
Perfect.
Excellent. So there's the document, Friendships for and with Te Urewera, and down the bottom is the reference of the paper. And the points I was trying to make here is out of this work, it really pointed me to beginning to learn about the importance of arriving in research sites with care. And so that's not just getting to know the context of the people, but was also about just stopping to think about how my research practices shape those relationships, my ability to be in relationship with people in specific places, and how I show up as a non-Indigenous researcher. And just also very much recognising that some of how I'm perceived when I turn up is actually very much shaped by people's past experiences of science and past experiences of social science as the white savior, that a lot of social scientists and scientists, have turned up with the white savior identity. And this has actually really damaged our potential to do really good biodiversity science. So we have been shifting our lens onto our research cultures in order to do biodiversity science better. So how we identify ourselves is key to our research practices, and increasingly we are arriving as co-learners and co-producers of change in research projects, not as experts or detached observers. We're also supporting the growth of a self-aware science system, one that identifies its biases and is more intentional about its legacies. We're learning how white science, or the colonial legacies of science, can be put under the microscope before plants, insects, fungi, budgets, etc. And here you'll notice I'm going between science and social science. I'm using the large category of science, but sometimes emphasizing social science as part of it. I hope you'll just allow me to do that with some rough edges. So by putting our methods under the microscope before we put anything else, I'm trying to really emphasize here that we're getting to know about the practices of science that privilege what have often been minority worldviews from colonizing European contexts. And we're finding ways to build critique and contextual analysis into the beginning of biodiversity science initiatives, so that biodiversity itself can be understood more effectively. This is an opportunity for biodiversity science to enable more diversity with who gets to see, assess, who gets to name, categorize, analyze, know, decide, and respond to biodiversity issues. As these socio-cultural processes give attention to some aspects of biodiversity over others, and they can often make some aspects of biodiversity invisible. So we are becoming, as we understand how these practices for biodiversity science do make things invisible or invisible, we are becoming more hopeful and more informed that more informed responses for biodiversity can be made. So we know that the biodiversity crisis is growing. We also know that for people to proactively address crises, they need to be hopeful. And here I'm going to just draw on an international social scientist that I'm hoping that you might have heard because of it, shows on Netflix, but Brené Brown, internationally known social scientist now. She's talks about being hopeful, not just as an emotion, but it's actually breaks it down to understanding that being hopeful is about having a goal, seeing a number of pathways for achieving this goal, and being able to switch between them. And so that's also very much about having the agency to do so, to take a path or not. So research shows that we need to draw on a wider range of worldviews and knowledge about the environment than has dominated modern industrialized development. Achieving this goal has many pathways, as social scientists sorry, I was getting distracted by the bing bongs. Achieving this goal has many pathways. As social scientists working in Aotearoa, one of these pathways is to grow conversations about decolonisation. To actively participate in these conversations, we're learning about what shapes our worldviews and the knowledge systems we participate in. Through this learning, we are fostering relationships with Te Ao Māori, Indigenous cultures, and becoming more hopeful. We can see possibilities for impactful social science, and more importantly, we are hopeful for biodiversity. So now I'd like to hear more about my colleagues' experiences of becoming hopeful for biodiversity. And as we share some of our reflections, you'll see that we're talking about two of the indicators that have come through in the methodological sensitivities paper. I use the term indicators here because I thought it would probably have a wider reach. But in the methodological sensitivities, we're really talking about these indicators as the things that are sensitizing us to being able to know biodiversity differently and through the co-production of knowledge across worldviews, across knowledge systems. So it's what's sensitizing us to different ways of doing research. And so one of the first things that came through quite clearly for me in the work that I was doing with Te Rewera was just the importance of thinking about generalizations, because working with Ngāi Tūhoe, they're very clear that their ways of working and thinking are very connected to their place, and that they have no expectation that actually other people in Aotearoa will do things the same way that they will be doing. But what's important is that they are understood for how that they want to care for the land and all that's in it. So as social researchers, the context specificity is so important, but this is also really important for those collecting data as well, and just stopping to think about what can be generalized when and how and via whom is actually a really important pause that is happening in a range of places with the biodiversity science that I'm aware of through Aotearoa. It's stopping to think about the questions of data sovereignty, stopping to think about who gets involved in the analysis processes, and how much of that data is maintained by Indigenous people, and what are the politics around releasing that. So that's my reflection, and I'm keen to hear from you, Nick, about your thoughts on being careful with generalisations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alison. Yeah, just to reiterate, I guess from the the perspective that I was trained in, the Western sort of scientific perspective, even in social science, it's seen as, being able to make a generalization is often seen as something which is quite powerful if you're able to identify some sort of connection or relationship between different elements, and you believe that this is universal. Then that's quite powerful. It means it can inform all sorts of different things, from the ways that we interact with our environment to how we use our natural resources and to the policies and laws that are created for them. But as Alison pointed out with her example from Ngāi Tūhoe, often the knowledge that is generated by Indigenous groups is very place and context specific. And I certainly know from my relationships and working relationships with Māori, they often most closely identify with their sub-tribal identity. And so with places that are often quite small and quite unique from even the other places and sub-tribal units within their tribe. So when you're working with them, trying to generalize across, to make claims around what is, for example, Māori knowledge or what is the tribal knowledge, can often become difficult because they operate in entirely different ways. And this is certainly in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand is incredibly important to know when approaching and trying to partner with Māori for research opportunities, or when responding to invitations from Māori groups and organisations to be involved. And just another sort of element to this is that, and again, this differs across our nation, but for some Māori, elements like water and soil are considered deeply like they are their ancestors. And so if we're taking samples of these, it could be akin to taking samples, of their ancestors. And so although this might seem like a different or this might seem quite foreign to some scientists working, it is really important to try and listen and be aware of these sensitivities and reflect these in your methods and approaches. And so, yeah, that's just some sort of advice from me and from my experience. But yeah, I'll pass it on to Andrea to sort of add her thoughts as well.
Thanks for that, Nick. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to me when we're thinking about generalizations and what we take away from contexts, you know, and this is a science practice that we universalize our knowledge. We try and look at it as applying in all circumstances and situations. But one of the things I've learned from working with Māori is this approach of appreciating what context brings to the particular entities that we extract and learn from. So, you know, things might, and this practice of extraction is a particular mindset about how we understand. So it does open up, it's really opened up some thinking for me around, you know, what the imperatives are behind our science practices when we're generalizing, and what we miss out by extracting that knowledge out away from its context. So it's a practice and an imperative in how we validate our science knowledge systems that doesn't fit well with, in my understanding of Indigenous ways of being and doing. So this has been a real insight for me, and one of the things from a Māori perspective is this appreciation and awareness of these extraction processes, this idea that research, social science included, comes and takes knowledge away and develops it somewhere else. So there's a kaupapa Māori practice which talks about by Māori, for Māori, with Māori, and that these are things that we're not accustomed to when we're doing our science research that contributes to part of this aspect of generalisation. So it's a lack of acknowledgement, really, of people's connections to place and species that go beyond that sort of objectification of knowledge and realisation that there are relationships, spiritual, metaphysical, and sometimes just the way things are interacting in a local environment that we often miss out on if we're extracting knowledge.
Thanks, Andrea. And you've really just begun to prompt us to start thinking about power relations as well with regards to our methods, and what, with that extraction around who extracts and who's invited to extract, and what are the protocols around that. And so you know, some changes, there's, you know, lots changing with biodiversity science in Aotearoa New Zealand. And so one of the things that I'm aware of is that increasingly more rigorous permissions are being sought around data collection and data use, and that's both for biophysical and social data. And you know, in my own experience, just really having thorough processes that help me to think about how the research I'm doing might inflame a particular contestation that's happening in a place, you know, and so being able to be aware that all research does have a social impact is really important. So I'm keen to hear from you, Andrea, more on your thoughts around how you go about assessing and what you're learning about assessing the power relations of methods.
Oh yeah, I think that's a really pertinent question, because I think that often we don't realise that the frameworks that we lay over research problems actually come from a cultural perspective, because we're in that culture, we don't see it. And it's not until you kind of can see that from outside of your culture that you start to recognise and see the boundaries that you put around the kinds of research problems that you're investigating. And from my experiences of working with Māori, that often this not giving recognition to those power relationships that sit behind the framing of problems becomes really obvious, and that if we're not actually involved in bringing together different perspectives in order to frame those problems, those research problems and the questions that we ask, then we're not actually allowing that kind of equality of voice in that can bring up those different perspectives. So I think it's in some ways how we go about the legacies of colonization and the impacts of our own culture that we've grown up with and become so accustomed to and normalized on those Indigenous ways of knowing and being.
Nick, have you got some thoughts around power relations and methods?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Alison and Andrew. So yeah, as I said before, my background's in natural resource management, and one of the techniques of natural resource management that's been very popular here over the last decade, and I know has also been experimented with in Australia, is collaborative governance. So for those of you that don't know about it, collaborative governance is a style of management and natural resource management where instead of leaving the decisions up to elected officials or by having a vote about things, instead what you do is you bring people together, make sure there is a sort of an even representation of different groups, and you try and seek consensus on a particular issue. And one of the things which has come out of the global literature on collaborative governance is that even when you try and share power and decision making in this way, if you're not as well resourced as one of those decision making parties as some of the others, you will not have the same opportunity to be able to influence the actual outcome of the collaboration. And so in particular in New Zealand, we're beginning to find that that Māori are quite stretched because they are asked to collaborate and participate in all types of different decision-making exercises. This is because the Treaty of Waitangi stresses a partnership between the Crown and Māori, and so when governments of all kind are making decisions, they need to at the very least consult but collaborate and partner with Māori organisations, and including in collaborative governance experiments that I've looked at. But one of the issues is that without giving Māori the proper resources to be able to fulfil this role, it nearly ends up achieving the opposite of what was hoped, which is diluting some of their influence and impact over those decision-making process. So as well, for those people that maybe are working in trans or interdisciplinary research projects with Indigenous groups, this is something as well to be aware of. Even if you're inviting them into that space, if they're really stretched and don't have the resources or the knowledge or the skills to be able to participate fully in what you're doing, it might end up being the kind of process that actually ends up sort of feeling exclusive for them. So this is a surmountable problem, but is one that's perhaps not always fully appreciated in the move to try, as I say, include and partner with Indigenous groups in either research or decision making. So yeah, that's just some of my reflections on the power relations issue. So I'll throw it back to you, Alice.
Thanks, Nick. And what we're doing here, and a big part of the research processes that I'm involved with, is really growing our capabilities for reflexive practice. So that's taking time to question the power and think about the who and of whose knowledge is shaping what we do. And I'm increasingly seeing that being built into research projects and programs and wider initiatives. Is just actually building greater critical reflection, about the range of knowledges that are naming problems and shaping co-designing towards outcomes. So, a big part of what we're talking about is connecting with diverse worldviews. Or, one of the ways that we've been saying it is actually just stopping to question whose eyes are looking down the microscope, who gets to shape the lens of inquiry, and who gets to turn up to ask the questions, to create the methods is so important, to be asking not only at the beginning of our initiatives, but actually throughout them as well. So that's, when I talked earlier about a science system that's becoming more aware of itself, it's this growing capacity for reflection that I'm delighted to see and trying hard to support. So Nick, tell us more about how you've been thinking about diverse worldviews and how you work with them.
Yeah, I just wanted to share another sort of example from my research, perhaps sort of flipping this issue around a wee bit about times where I was invited into an Indigenous space to help run something which is called a hui, which is basically just a meeting, but specifically to run a hui with Māori land management advisors. This process was run with Māori protocols and values, and it was quite daunting at first. The reason I was running it was because the Māori lead of this research project was unable to be there. So I was sort of asked to fill in this gap. Luckily, I did have really good guidance on what I needed to do and when. And I found that when I went in with an open and honest approach about the fact that, I was new to all of this and was doing my best, I was able to successfully run the hui. It was quite interesting that some of the protocols that I wasn't aware of, there's this process called whakawhanaungatanga, where people draw connections between themselves at the start of a meeting and sort of talk about their connections, either in a directly familial sense or perhaps place-based connections. And it was really fascinating to learn after the fact that they actually sort of took it upon themselves to go through this process, and it created a really convivial atmosphere to the meeting. And ultimately, I think the way the hui ended up planning out, it provided a way for these advisors to talk about an issue in a space that they found culturally familiar and comfortable. And I was really happy to be able to provide that. But I do recognise, and this has been maybe something that we've hopefully stressed throughout this talk, is that I was in a position where I was invited to do this. I would feel like I'd be pretty uncomfortable doing it if I was trying to press myself as the person that was that should be doing it or was in a role to do it. But being invited and having that guidance and learning about how to do it in a culturally respectful way was very interesting, and also sort of highlighted to me how this kind of sort of maybe what for social scientists might seem like a conventional kind of research method, like a workshop / focus group, could be run quite differently and according to Indigenous values and protocols, to create the space where they felt more comfortable to be able to share with me. So that's one experience I wanted to share. But maybe Andrew, do you have something to share with us around this?
Yes, thanks, Nick. It's good to hear you talking about those experiences. Sort of in some ways, similar things have happened to me as as new to Aotearoa, New Zealand. But I think one of the key things about appreciating diversity in worldviews is that aspect, where you have to deauthorize yourself. Like, it's approaching with humility and appreciating, that we've all got valid expertise. And I think, there's a tendency to become in as the expert and not realizing, that can bring dominating worldviews into a context. So it's been important for me to learn about the need for listening, to understand differences in how we approach problems and their solutions, which I referred to before. But I think it's appreciation of the value of other knowledge, and I think the other thing that feels like a connector for me in these times where you are recognizing differences in worldviews, you know, coming from a position of power versus disempowerment, that that connections can be made through values and the way that we value things. And I think, you know, we've overemphasized a particular kind of valuing of our natural environment that's been about, you know, exploitation and development of resources for progress and growth. But that has meant that we've undervalued all these other things that have been so important to sustaining Indigenous cultures over so many more millennia than we've experienced in our modern world. So I think that there are deep lengths of time associated with knowledge and appreciations of time, and what's required to open yourself up to appreciating that length and depth of knowledge, and that we also have different concepts of time. So connecting around values and appreciating how languages can create different kinds of relationships between people and place is, you know, it takes quite a lot. But I think humility is a good starting point. Alison, do you have some more thoughts on that?
Well, thank you so much. And in our attempts to be humble as we've, you know, here in your space in Western Australia, we would like to turn shortly to have hearing more from you. Just wanted to recognise that the journal paper that we wrote was in a special feature led by Kirsten McLean, who is in Australia with CSIRO, and in that special feature in sustainability science, there are a number of examples from Australia, from Canada and from Asia around other people's learning journeys, how other people have been positioning themselves in relationships across Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So the slide that I'm about to put up, you'll see the reference there. And so I'm just going to finalise with, you know, some wrap-up points, and I am sharing my screen now. So yes, here's the editorial for Kirsten McLean's sustainability science feature, which I hope more of you will read. And just, you know, what we've talked about today, just 3 of the indicators or 3 of the methodological sensitivities that we wrote about in our paper. We just wanted to, you know, talk through them slowly with you. There are some more, and we'd be keen to hear your thoughts on those. But yeah, really interested to hear from you now about how you reflect on your research methods and practices that you're using for biodiversity science. You know, what do you see when you take time to check the lenses of your inquiry that you're using for biodiversity? So yeah, looking forward to hearing questions, but also some reflections from you. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for a really informative and insightful discussion and a really sensitive journey through what can be a very challenging area of thinking and discussion, because we often have not got it right in the past, and I think that's very important to acknowledge. And I think, Alison, in your opening, that reflection on the fact that even the best efforts today are being seen or experienced through a series of experiences of poor performance by science in the past, and a very colonial approach or extractive approach, that notion of coming in, doing and leaving, sort of extractive science, in the background. Just picking up on a couple of things that were mentioned through the discussion while we wait for some thoughts to come through on the chat. And please, participants, feel free to put your reflections or questions or insights into the chat function, and don't feel constrained by rapidity of typing. We'll forgive typos and grammar. On this occasion, we're not marking your assignment. But that concept of there's sort of tensions there between different concepts of time and timeliness. That need to invest in relationship, that need to put time aside at the beginning of studies to really understand what are the questions that the traditional owners, the Maori in the New Zealand Aotearoa case, want to answer and need answered versus what we as Western scientists are coming in with our worldview. So there's that aspect of the co-development at the outset, even before a funding proposal, even before an initiation of a project. But the flip side of that coin for both parties in that discussion is a pressure of time. A couple of you mentioned that the Maori are stretched in their resource because of the need for consultation that's embedded in treaty, and we see that in drawing on leaders in the community, in the Australian context, in the Indigenous community, that those leaders have roles in their community. They have roles that are important, and then we're drawing them into our discussion as well. So it's that stretch of time. That time invested is important, it's essential, and yet time is limited. Maybe some thought or reflection on that.
In hearing you talk, I was also thinking about, in some cases, there is evidence that the time taken means a much more effective outcome for dealing with a problem. So in some ways, our science systems can be so embedded in particular pathways that we might not be actually achieving the knowledge outcomes that we need in a time of crisis. So taking the time to do things differently may actually give us time, may mean that we make much better responses much more quickly than we would if we just kept on doing what we've been doing. So, there are some arguments around that. There's some evidence, on particular issues that is the case. And then we are experimenting and yet to work out, quite what those impacts are.
I might add to that, Alison. I think, some of these things are built into our structures, that our funding systems don't allow us the time to develop those relationships. So how do we do that outside of our routine work, if you like? Because, this is a, you can't build relationships without time, and you can't, share perspectives and get deeper insight into what are the research questions or problems we should be asking to help address our biodiversity crisis. So there are structural shifts that it feels like they need to happen, and yet all of those issues that you raised, Owen, around not having the resources to be able to contribute to the growing pull on Indigenous people's contributions, and so there's like there is a real leadership tension around how we manage these things. And I know that Australia is currently going through a conversation around the Uluru Statement, and that these are things that we are being invited to consider.
Nick, anything to add in that space?
Not really, other than I think you have identified a very real tension there, Owen, and described it pretty well. And I think Andrea and Alison's responses have been quite good. One thing maybe I'll add is that this is actually the insight from all of us has actually started to influence how we engage with non-Indigenous communities as well. So with one research project that I'm involved with, we're working a lot with farmers in the farming community, and we decided that we weren't going to set up effectively like a farmer stakeholder reference group for our small little bit of project, because we recognized that they were already the people that we would be invited and who would be keen to join in were already participating in all sorts of different other things, and that it would be placing extra stress on their time, and that we hadn't really articulated a need for it. And I think, again, coming back to that issue of invitation, is that if you're invited by Indigenous groups to partner with them over a particular sort of science issue, then it's at that stage where I think you ought to spend the time to build that relationship. And of course, if you want to invite Indigenous groups to join into your work, you can do that, but just accept that it might be difficult for them to provide the level of insight that you're looking for, because they are stretched by the multiple competing demands, which I think, Owen, in the Australian context, you articulated pretty well. So yeah, it's a tough one, but yeah, like I say, I think you just have, in the theme of the whole talk, you just got to be sort of sensitive to these things and try and listen and work your way through. Thanks, Alison.
And just one more thing on a shortcut to speed things up is actually recognizing that relationships do already exist in lots of places, but they perhaps haven't been honoured, actually. So if people actually just start listening to what has been said time and again and just responding to what Indigenous peoples have been asking of us, then, you know, we'd probably speed things up quite a lot too.
Yeah. Thank you. Paraphrasing one thought that's come through on the chat, and it's thinking about reflective practice and how for many natural scientists, reflective practice doesn't come naturally. It can be quite challenging to the empiricist to take that reflective approach. So sort of a little bit of science navel gazing and asking you for any hints or techniques or approaches for colleagues in the science community that are a little uncomfortable with the notion of reflective practice and that gaze at our own methods.
So I will start by saying, yeah, this is, for me, over the years, has been something that I've been challenged by, but also really appreciate learning. So some things that I've found helpful is actually thinking about that whilst it's uncomfortable, there are actually parts of science cultures that do have that reflection, and I'm aware in conference processes and often the culture around field trips or the culture around dinners at conferences actually is a culture of reflection and self-awareness. So I think there are existing practices within science that do have that, and it's a matter of drawing on those and working with those cultures that they do exist. Another one that I've seen useful as science becomes much closer in relationship with management, with diverse stakeholders, that culture of reflection is becoming a bit more normalized as well. So just actually providing the spaces, and by the research stepping into new places, it actually does allow people to practice, and that's what we were trying to do here, is actually create space for practicing that reflection. Hanging out with social scientists forces it, so I do recommend that. But also I think most people have something in their life where they have been challenged and had to work through, you know, whether it was learning a new skill in sport or whether it was becoming a parent, you know, where actually scientists have other parts of their lives where they are actually doing reflective practice, and we work with that.
Thanks. I think that's a really useful insight to note that the scientists are already engaging in reflective practice. They just may not recognise it. You mentioned field trips and conference dinners, and immediately I think about the value of spending time walking on country with traditional owners, spending time eating with community, and how naturally that happens in our taking of field trips with students, with colleagues, and they are the same thing. They are that same approach. So it's very good to see those sort of clicking together. Nick, in your introduction, so going right back to the beginning of the seminar, you were talking about approaches and practices that would no longer be acceptable, and you also at another point in the discussion talked about the need for a really respectful approach, and you used the example of soil samples and water samples that may be considered ancestral to the community that you're taking this from. So a sort of a two-part question around that. Any comment on how to gain that knowledge as we move through our practice of science and as we work with community? Because sometimes those aspects of knowledge are held back in the early communications because they are something that's confronting, and so they're not shared. So we start a process that then later we come to know is not culturally acceptable, or later we come to know is difficult. And then sort of the second part to this question, and we can loop back and remind you of it after some thought, was is balancing that respect with the practical constraints of Western science. That, you know, if you want to take a soil sample and put it through a mass spectrometer, you can't do that respectfully in the field. You can't bring the mass spectrometer on country. So how do we get that? How do we get that balance? So two parts to that question.
Thanks for that, Alan. Yeah, the big issues. I think maybe it'll be good for the audience to know that, you know, the way that I've you know, reached some of these conclusions is through failure. It is through making some of those mistakes which you just talked about, Owen. And I'm not talking about 10 years ago either. I'm talking about, you know, this year, where we have gone in to partner and to do work which is we went in with the best intentions, but did cause unintentional offence. And in that situation, you know, it was something that I saw as, you know, I didn't want to just treat it like it was an opportunity for learning, because then it might sort of cheapen the offence that was caused by our actions. But I think what I've been able to do is, and this I was actually thinking of in reflection to the first question that you raised, which is that if you feel like you're beginning to get defensive about your methods, about your approach, or potentially about the results of your science and your research, I think that's a really important moment in which you should begin sort of trying to actively listen to whatever like criticism or pushback that you're getting. Maybe they are being unreasonable, but there's probably a high chance that it's just that there are elements to what you're doing or context that you don't know about, which you talked about, Owen, that might be sort of withheld from you because it's private context, but to actually sort of like really reflect on that and try and think about how your actions could have potentially inflamed that and how you'll do things different in the future. And so it's that that process of active listening, and whenever I get defensive about anything in regards to my research, I then try and think about, wait a second, there is probably something that's underpinning why someone has been offended or misinterpreted what I've tried to do. So that's one thing I can just share in this context, which is to say that's why we wanted to reach out to all of you as well, because we're not experts on this. We are learning at the same time. We're building the ship while sailing it simultaneously, and we're building it alongside our Indigenous partners who are also learning how to engage with us in a way where they feel like they're able to maintain their, like their mana, their respect and their authority over what they hold dear to them. So that could include things like I was talking about, like soil samples or water samples, which they perceive to be quite different from us. I know, and maybe Alison knows more about this, those issues about, say, like taking samples from Indigenous areas and then using them for science is something which is like actively being debated within our Crown Research Institutes at the moment, and is something which across the different kinds of science we do have, there's just different things that are going on. So from a social science perspective, we're not collecting those things, but yeah, there's a lot going on in terms of like biodiversity research. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, Alice.
Well, thanks. There is a lot going on, and I think this place where a lot of people are at the moment is showing that they're hearing the concerns, showing that they're open to having a conversation about how things could be done differently. And so I don't think there's an answer to your mass spectrometer, but I think the point is it needs to be talked about. It needs to be worked through with the layers and layers of people. So it might actually be that we have a conversation and realize actually haven't talked to the right people. We've got to have another one. And then maybe that conversation is different in another part of Australia, so it's ongoing, but showing that we're hearing and allowing the concerns to be raised and creating processes so that the power structures around deciding what to do change.
I think I just wanted to add a little comment there. I think another aspect of the science culture, if you like, or our practices as scientists has been not to go back to these communities and speak about what you are finding. I mean, the tendency is to, get published in a peer-reviewed publication. So the dialogue and engagement about what's being learnt doesn't necessarily go back to the places where the original samples have been collected from, and that's a key thing we can do differently.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Andrea, that returning the knowledge, so that it removes from that extractive approach of we're coming to study and we're taking it away and sharing it through those so accessible if you're in our university peer-reviewed journals, but for everyone else it might as well be in a locked box. So it's being able to come back to communities, and that goes beyond traditional owner communities, to everyone we work with, and bringing the knowledge back to the systems where it's created. So I would just throw the floor open to you for any final thoughts or reflections of the discussion and conversation so far, and prompt our audience for any last chance for them for thoughts or discussions as well, or questions as well.
So hopefully you'll have our email addresses and contact details. So yeah, please do follow up with us if there's an opportunity to continue this conversation, or that you've got some things that you'd like to share with us. Really keen to keep talking about this and working out what spaces we could grow together for this kind of deeper reflection on methods and research approaches.
Yeah, just I echo that, Alison, and just want to thank you for the opportunity for letting us speak and come and talk to you today. It's been it's been a privilege to have this conversation, and if you're able to keep in contact with us and to continue it, that would be fantastic.
Excellent. And for our participants, a reminder that you will receive a link to a recording of the webinar, and we'll ensure that we include contact details. Preeti has just dropped a link into the webinar chat for folks to look at. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is our last webinar for 2022, but the webinar series will continue next year in 2023, and I look forward to being able to share updates on the new series of talks that will come throughout the year. So look out for announcements in your inbox or on our website. Thank you again to our three presenters today. I really appreciate the time and the thought that has been shared with us this afternoon, and we will draw the meeting and the webinar to a close. Thank you.